The Montana wheat field stretched endlessly under the grey October sky of 1944, broken only by Heinrich Mueller's weathered farmhouse and the red barn that held his darkest secret. When Heinrich pushed open the heavy wooden doors that morning, expecting to find his usual hay bales and rusted tools, 3 bloodied men in German uniforms lay bound and gagged in the corner. But Heinrich Mueller wasn't really a farmer. He was Hans Richter, a former SS officer who'd fled Germany 2 years earlier with stolen Nazi gold and a new identity. As he cut their ropes, the prisoners began speaking in rapid German, their words freezing his blood. They weren't escaped POWs from the local camp. They were Gestapo agents sent to find him, but something had gone terribly wrong. The man who'd tied them up had left a note. "The gold you stole belonged to Jewish families. Now you'll all pay." Heinrich realized someone knew exactly who he was, where the treasure was buried, and was playing a deadly game of justice. The question that would haunt him and change everything was simple: who was hunting the hunter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heinrich's hands trembled as he held the note, his eyes darting between the 3 men who were slowly regaining their composure. The eldest of the prisoners, a sharp-faced man with steel-grey eyes, spat blood onto the barn floor before speaking. "You are Hans Richter," the man said in German, his voice hoarse but certain. "We have traveled very far to find you." Heinrich forced his expression to remain neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. In his 2 years of hiding in this God-forsaken corner of Montana, he had perfected the role of the simple farmer. His English carried just enough of an accent to suggest German heritage without raising suspicion, and his story of losing family in the bombing of Hamburg had earned him the quiet sympathy of his neighbors. "I don't know what you're talking about," Heinrich replied in English, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "My name is Heinrich Mueller. I'm a farmer." The second prisoner, younger with blonde hair matted with dried blood, laughed bitterly. "The accent gives you away, Herr Richter. We know about the transport you intercepted outside Krakow. 23 kilograms of gold jewelry, wedding rings, family heirlooms, all of it meant for the Reich's coffers." Heinrich's facade cracked slightly. The Krakow operation, he had thought all witnesses were eliminated. That gold had been his escape plan, his insurance policy against a Germany that was clearly losing the war. He had watched too many SS officers hang for following orders to remain loyal to a sinking ship. "Who brought you here?" Heinrich asked, switching to German. There was no point in maintaining the charade now. "Who tied you up?" The third man, who had remained silent until now, struggled to sit up straighter. A deep gash across his forehead had painted half his face crimson. An American, older man, maybe 60, spoke perfect German, better than some Germans I know. He knew things about our mission that should have been impossible. Heinrich's blood ran cold. Only a handful of people could have known about the Gestapo's search for him, and most of them were either dead or trapped in a crumbling Reich. The implications were staggering. What did he look like? Heinrich pressed. Tall, thin, scarred hands. He had photographs of you, from before you fled. The grey-eyed man's voice carried a note of grudging respect. He also had detailed records of every Jewish family whose possessions you stole, names, addresses, even pictures of their children. The barn fell silent except for the wind whistling through gaps in the wooden walls. Heinrich's mind raced through possibilities. A surviving victim, an American intelligence agent, someone from his own past seeking revenge. "He said to give you a message," the blonde prisoner continued, "that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that you have until sunset tomorrow to return what you stole, or the local sheriff will receive some very interesting information about Heinrich Mueller's true identity." Heinrich walked to the barn window and stared out at the wheat fields that had become his sanctuary. Somewhere beneath this peaceful landscape lay his insurance, 23 kilograms of gold that represented the life savings, wedding gifts, and precious heirlooms of families who had likely perished in the camps. He had told himself it was survival, that the gold would have been melted down anyway. Now someone was forcing him to confront the truth he had buried as deeply as the treasure itself. "There's something else," the wounded man said quietly. "He claimed to know where the rest of it is hidden." Heinrich spun around. "What rest?" "He said the Krakow transport was just one of many. That you've been stealing from the Reich's collections for over a year before you fled." The man's eyes narrowed. "Is that true, Richter?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Heinrich realized that his past had finally caught up with him in ways he never imagined possible. The rope around the tallest prisoner's wrists had been tied by someone who knew what they were doing. Ernst examined the knots as dawn light filtered through the barn's weathered slats, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Military precision, but not German military. He'd tied enough of those knots himself to recognize the difference. "Water," the young one croaked again, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Bit." Ernst ignored him, focusing instead on the middle prisoner, the one who'd remained silent since he'd found them. This one watched him with calculating eyes, cataloguing every movement, every detail. A professional, the kind of man who survived by reading people correctly. "You're not a farmer," the silent one said finally, his English accented but precise. Ernst continued his examination without looking up. "And you're not prisoners." It wasn't a question. Real POWs would have given him name, rank, and serial number by now. These three wore Wehrmacht uniforms, but the fabric was wrong, too clean, too new. The stitching on their insignia was machine perfect, not the rough field repairs he'd seen countless times during his years in intelligence. "Who tied you up?" Ernst asked, straightening to his full height. At 62, he still cut an imposing figure, though he'd traded his major's uniform for farmer's overalls 3 years ago. The tall one shifted uncomfortably. "Americans, patrol unit. They left us here to—" "Liar." Ernst's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "No American patrol unit operates within 50 miles of here. I would know." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, and the silent prisoner's eyes sharpened with interest. Ernst cursed internally. Retirement had made him careless with words. "You monitor radio traffic," the silent one observed. "Military frequencies." Ernst walked to the barn's far corner where he kept his tools, deliberately turning his back on the prisoners. It was a calculated risk, but their restraints were secure, and he needed to think. His fingers found the handle of an old pitchfork, its metal worn smooth by years of use. 3 weeks ago," he said without turning around, "a coded transmission was intercepted. Someone was looking for Heinrich Zimmermann." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. That someone was very interested in his work on atomic fission. The young prisoner inhaled sharply, too sharply for someone who shouldn't recognize the name. Ernst turned back to face them, pitchfork in hand. "Heinrich disappeared from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in 1942, Ernst continued, studying their faces, "along with certain research documents that both sides would very much like to recover." The silent prisoner's composure finally cracked. "If you know about Zimmermann, then you know what's at stake. The war could end in months if we, Ernst stepped closer. Interesting choice of words for a German prisoner. "What do you want?" the tall one demanded, struggling against his bonds. "Money? Safe passage? We can arrange." Ernst drove the pitchfork into the ground, inches from the man's feet, silencing him instantly. "I want the truth, starting with who you really are and why you're on my land." The morning silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Ernst had learned patience during his years in military intelligence, had mastered the art of waiting for men to break under the weight of their own secrets. It was the silent one who broke first. "Operation Bernhard," he said quietly. "We're part of a joint operation. Anglo-American intelligence working with German defectors." "Bullshit," Ernst said, but something in the man's tone made him listen. "The Nazi atomic program isn't dead," the prisoner continued. "They've moved it underground, literally. A facility in the Alps, run by SS Oberführer Klaus Richter. He has Zimmermann, He has the research, and he's closer to a working bomb than either London or Washington wants to admit. Ernst felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew Richter's name, knew it well enough to wake in cold sweats some nights, remembering Prague and what that monster had done there. Even if that were true, Ernst said carefully, what does it have to do with 3 fake prisoners appearing on a retired farmer's property? The silent prisoner smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression, because the retired farmer isn't retired. And he isn't a farmer. His eyes locked onto Ernst's. Hello, Major Ernst Hoffman. We've been looking for you for a very long time. The pitchfork slipped from Ernst's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the barn floor. His cover hadn't been blown in 3 years of careful isolation. His death had been confirmed, documented, filed away in intelligence archives on both sides of the war. Impossible, he whispered. Your old friend Sarah Chen sends her regards, the prisoner continued. She says it's time to come in from the cold. The first prisoner's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Heinrich Mueller sat rigid against the barn post, his pale eyes reflecting something between terror and resignation. The younger one, Klaus, he'd said, pressed closer to the wooden beam, as if trying to disappear into the grain of the wood itself. Operation Bernhard, Heinrich repeated, his English heavily accented but precise. You must understand, we are not soldiers. We were specialists. Samuel kept the shotgun steady, though his mind raced through possibilities. The name meant nothing to him, but the way Heinrich spoke it suggested significance far beyond what 3 men tied in a barn should possess. Specialists in what? Forgery. The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. The most sophisticated counterfeiting operation in history. British pounds, American dollars, perfect reproductions that even bank officials could not detect. The third prisoner, who had remained silent until now, finally lifted his head. Older than the others, with greying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. When he spoke, his English carried an educated refinement that made Samuel's jaw tighten. Perhaps I should explain, the older man said. My name is Dr. Friedrich Weber. Until 6 days ago, I was the technical director of a facility that has produced over £8 billion in counterfeit currency. Samuel's grip on the weapon shifted almost imperceptibly. 8 billion. The number was staggering, incomprehensible. You're lying. I wish we were, Klaus whispered, speaking for the first time since giving his name. We've helped create enough false currency to collapse the entire British economy. And now, he swallowed hard, now they want to kill us to protect the secret. The barn felt smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper. Samuel studied their faces, looking for deception, for the telltale signs of a coordinated lie. But what he saw instead was the particular kind of exhaustion that came from carrying an unbearable truth. Who wants to kill you? Our own people, Heinrich said bitterly. The SS discovered that some of us had been selective in our production quality, deliberately introducing microscopic flaws that would eventually be detected. We thought we were serving a higher purpose, that sabotaging the operation from within might what? Samuel's voice was sharper now. Might salve your conscience while you helped wage economic warfare? Dr. Weber's laugh was hollow. Economic warfare was only the beginning. The plan was to flood Britain and America with perfect counterfeits, destabilize their currencies, fund resistance movements in occupied territories loyal to the Reich. £8 billion, Mr. He paused, waiting for Samuel to provide his name. When none came, he continued. £8 billion could purchase loyalty, equipment, information, could fund operations that conventional military might could never accomplish. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't the rambling of desperate men trying to save themselves with elaborate fiction. The details were too precise, too technical, the fear in their eyes too genuine. You said 6 days ago. What happened 6 days ago? We were discovered, Klaus said, his voice barely audible. Heinrich and I were arrested first. Dr. Weber, He glanced at the older man. Dr. Weber tried to destroy the printing plates. I succeeded in destroying some of them, Weber corrected. The plates for the 20-pound notes, and the masters for the dollar bills. But the facility held years of work, multiple currencies. What I destroyed was perhaps 20% of their capability. They brought us together for interrogation, Heinrich continued. We were to be executed that night, after they extracted the locations of any materials we might have hidden. But the facility came under attack. Samuel frowned. Attack from whom? We don't know, Weber admitted. Allied forces, perhaps, or maybe resistance fighters who had learned of the operation. There was bombing, chaos. In the confusion, we escaped. 3 of you, somehow managing to flee together from an SS interrogation facility. The prisoners exchanged glances. Klaus spoke first. There was someone else, a guard who helped us. He said there were people who had been watching, waiting for the right moment. What people? He didn't say. Only that we needed to reach someone named Samuel Carter, a farmer in the mountains. He gave us directions, told us to mention the name Nightingale if we found him. The shotgun wavered in Samuel's hands for just a moment before steadying again. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, something shifted like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Nightingale, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 2 years. A name that belonged to a life he'd buried as completely as any corpse. This guard, Samuel said carefully. What did he look like? Tall, thin, dark hair. He had a scar here. Heinrich indicated his left temple, and when he spoke English he sounded American. The barn fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. Samuel stared at the 3 men bound before him, his mind working through implications and possibilities, calculating risks and probabilities with a precision that would have surprised them. Finally, he lowered the shotgun. The barn felt smaller now, heavy with the weight of revelations that defied everything Heinrich thought he knew about the war. The 3 prisoners had fallen silent after their confession, watching him with a mixture of desperation and calculation that made his skin crawl. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the weathered boards and sending shadows dancing across the hay-strewn floor. Heinrich stepped back from the lantern's circle of light, his mind racing. Operation Bernhard. The name meant nothing to him, but the implications were staggering. If these men were telling the truth, if the Reich was flooding Allied territories with perfect counterfeit currency, the economic consequences could be catastrophic. Wars had been won and lost on far less. You expect me to believe, he said slowly, that you 3 stumbled upon this grand conspiracy by accident? The youngest prisoner, Klaus, shifted uncomfortably against his bonds. We were escorting a shipment from Sachsenhausen to Switzerland. Special cargo, they told us. Eyes only for Major Kruger. And you decided to peek? The truck broke down outside Mannheim. This from Dieter, the one with sergeant's stripes. We were waiting for repairs when the RAF came over. Direct hit on the cargo compartment. Bills scattered everywhere like leaves. Heinrich studied their faces in the flickering light. Fear, yes, but something else. Relief, as if the bombing had freed them from a burden they never wanted to carry. The quality was perfect, Weber whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Perfect paper, perfect ink. I held a 50-pound note up to the light, and I couldn't tell it from the real thing. None of us could. So you ran. We gathered what we could and burned the rest, Klaus said. Told our superiors the entire shipment was destroyed, but we kept samples, evidence. Heinrich felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the barn walls. Where are these samples? The 3 men exchanged glances. It was Weber who spoke, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Hidden. Safe. We can show you, but first, we need guarantees. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Aren't we? Weber's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. You've already shown more curiosity than any simple farmer should have. Your German is too good, your questions too precise. And that rifle of yours, He nodded toward the weapon still cradled in Heinrich's arms. K-98 Mauser, not standard Allied issue. The observation hung in the air like smoke. Heinrich felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation of walls closing in. 3 years of careful construction, 3 years of being nothing more than a quiet widower working land inherited from his wife's family. The backstory was solid, documented, rehearsed until it felt like truth. But these men had the trained eyes of soldiers, and soldiers noticed details that others missed. "I took it off a dead German," Heinrich said evenly. "After the liberation, seemed ashamed to waste good equipment." Klaus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The safety catch. You check it automatically every time you shift position. Muscle memory, training, the kind that takes months to develop." Heinrich's jaw tightened. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. Whatever operation they'd stumbled into, whatever had driven them to flee across half of Europe, it had honed their observational skills to a razor's edge. "Even if that were true," he said, "it changes nothing. You're still my prisoners." "Are we?" Dieter leaned forward as much as his bonds would allow. "Or are we potential allies? Because if we're right about you, if you're not just some French farmer, then you understand what this means. Operation Bernhard isn't just counterfeiting, it's economic warfare on a scale never before attempted." The wind gusted harder, and something metallic clanged against the barn's exterior wall. Heinrich's head snapped toward the sound, every nerve suddenly alert. It could be nothing, a loose shutter, a piece of farm equipment shifted by the wind, but in his experience, it was the sounds that seemed like nothing that got you killed. He moved to the small window near the barn door, keeping the rifle trained on his prisoners while peering through the grime-stained glass. The farmyard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. No movement except the skeletal branches of the old oak swaying in the wind. But something was wrong. The chickens had gone silent. Heinrich backed away from the window, his mind shifting into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. Whether these prisoners were telling the truth about Operation Bernhard or not, whether they'd correctly identified him as something more than a farmer, those questions had suddenly become secondary. Someone else was out there in the darkness, and they were trying very hard not to be noticed. "How many others know you're here?" he whispered. The prisoners stared at him, confusion replacing their earlier confidence. "We came alone," Weber said. "There's no one." The barn door exploded inward. The rain drummed against the barn's tin roof as Heinrich spoke, his voice barely audible above the storm. Thomas remained motionless in the shadows, the Luger heavy in his weathered hand. Every instinct screamed at him to silence these men permanently, but something in Heinrich's tone, desperation mixed with resignation, held him back. "We were stationed at Peenemünde," Heinrich continued, his accent thick with exhaustion. "Research facility on the Baltic coast. What the Americans and British think they know about our rocket program." He shook his head. "They know nothing." Klaus shifted against his bonds, wincing. "Tell him about the American." Thomas felt his blood chill. "What American?" Heinrich's eyes found his in the dim light. "Dr. Robert Goddard, your rocket pioneer. He didn't die of throat cancer last year like your newspapers reported. We have him." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Goddard, the father of American rocketry, whose theories had been dismissed by his own government while the Germans embraced them. Thomas had read the obituaries, had mourned the loss of a brilliant mind taken too soon by disease. "Impossible," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The SS faked his death." Werner spoke for the first time, his younger voice cracking with strain. "Staged the funeral, everything. He was captured during a secret meeting with British intelligence in Switzerland. They've had him for 8 months. Thomas stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "You're lying." "The V3 project," Heinrich pressed on. "What do you think that is? Not another buzz bomb. It's Goddard's liquid fuel designs combined with our guidance systems. Intercontinental range. We're talking about striking New York, Washington, Los Angeles from launch sites in occupied France." The farmer's mind raced. He'd seen intelligence reports about German rocket development, knew about the V-1 and V-2 programs, but this, if it were true, would change everything. The war in Europe was winding down, everyone knew it. But a weapon capable of reaching American soil directly. "Why should I believe you?" Thomas asked, though he was already beginning to. Klaus struggled to sit up straighter. "Because we stole the complete technical specifications, blueprints, test data, Goddard's personal notes. Everything." He nodded toward a canvas bag lying near the barn door. "It's all there." Thomas followed his gaze. In his shock at discovering the prisoners, he'd barely noticed their equipment. Now he saw not just the bag Klaus indicated, but also what appeared to be radio gear hidden beneath a tarp. "We were trying to transmit to Allied forces when our transport was shot down," Heinrich explained. "We're not Wehrmacht, we're Abwehr, military intelligence, but we work for the resistance." This revelation struck Thomas harder than the news about Goddard. The Abwehr had been purged by Hitler years ago, its remnants either absorbed into the SS or eliminated entirely. "Unless Admiral Canaris," Thomas said quietly. Heinrich's eyes widened slightly. "You know of the Admiral?" Thomas did indeed know of Wilhelm Canaris, the former head of German military intelligence who had been executed the previous year for his role in plots against Hitler. But rumors persisted that not all of his network had been uncovered. "We've been feeding intelligence to the Allies for 2 years, Werner said. The Admiral's final orders were to prevent the V-3 program from succeeding. When we learned about Goddard, about what they were forcing him to build, we had to act," Klaus finished, "even if it meant our lives." Thomas studied their faces in the storm-filtered light. Their story was either the most elaborate deception he'd ever encountered or the most important intelligence breakthrough of the war. Either way, he was now involved whether he wanted to be or not. "The radio," he said, moving toward the tarp. "Does it work?" "We managed one partial transmission before the crash," Heinrich replied. "But we need a stronger signal to reach Allied command." Thomas pulled back the tarp, revealing a sophisticated short-wave radio setup, far more advanced than anything typical German soldiers would carry. His trained eye immediately recognized several components that matched equipment he'd used during his own intelligence work, before he'd supposedly died in a car accident outside London and been reborn as a simple American farmer. "There's something else," Werner said, his voice dropping lower. "The launch site. It's not in France like we told you. It's here." "Here?" Thomas spun around. "United States," Klaus clarified. "German submarines have been landing teams on the eastern seaboard for months. They're building the launch facility somewhere along the coast. Goddard isn't just designing the rockets. He's being forced to oversee their construction on American soil." Thunder crashed overhead, and Thomas realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest now brewing in his mind. If these men were telling the truth, the war was about to take a turn that no one, not Churchill, not Roosevelt, not even Hitler himself, could have anticipated. He looked down at the canvas bag containing what might be the most crucial intelligence of the entire war. The question was, could he trust them enough to act on it? The morning light filtered through the barn's weathered boards, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor where the 3 prisoners sat in uneasy silence. Ernst's confession from the night before hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Heinrich Mueller studied their faces, noting the way Klaus avoided his gaze while Weber's jaw remained stubbornly set. "You expect me to believe," Mueller said, his accent carefully neutral, "that SS Oberfuhrer Kessler orchestrated this elaborate deception to smuggle you here with documents that could end the war?" Ernst shifted against his bonds. "We expected you to kill us by now, farmer. The fact that we're still breathing suggests you understand the gravity of what I've told you." Muller's weathered hands moved methodically as he sharpened a farming blade against a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping filled the silence between them. "Perhaps I simply enjoy a good story." "This isn't a story," Klaus interjected, speaking for the first time since dawn. His young face was pale but determined. "The documents Weber carries, They contain proof of communications between high-ranking Nazi officials and Allied intelligence. Secret negotiations that began months ago. Weber shot Klaus a murderous look. "Schweinhund, keep your mouth shut!" "Why?" Klaus's voice cracked. "You heard what Mueller said last night. We're already dead men. At least let our deaths serve some purpose." Mueller's blade paused mid-stroke. Something in the young soldier's tone triggered a memory. Another voice, years ago, pleading for meaning in the face of certain death. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the present crisis. "Where are these documents now?" Mueller asked. Weber spat into the straw. "Go to hell!" Ernst looked between his companions, then back at Mueller, sewn into the lining of Klaus's jacket. Kessler chose him because no one would suspect a mere corporal of carrying such sensitive material. The revelation hit Klaus like a physical blow. "What? I thought you said the mission was reconnaissance." "You were never meant to survive the crossing," Ernst said quietly. "None of us were, but Kessler needed someone expendable to carry the real cargo while Weber and I served as decoys." The barn fell silent except for the soft rustling of mice in the rafters. Mueller set down his blade and studied Klaus's jacket, ordinary field grey wool, showing signs of hard travel but otherwise unremarkable. Inside those seams could be information that would reshape the war's trajectory, or it could be an elaborate trap designed to expose him. "Assuming these documents exist," Mueller said carefully, "what makes you think I have any interest in them? I'm just a farmer trying to survive until this madness ends." Ernst smiled grimly. "Because you speak German like a man born to it, not learned from books. Because you knew to check Weber for suicide pills without being told. And because when I mentioned Operation Valkyrie last night, your expression changed." Mueller's blood chilled. He'd been careful, but apparently not careful enough. "You're seeing things that aren't there." "Am I?" Ernst's eyes were sharp despite his exhaustion. "Tell me, Herr Farmer, how many agricultural workers know the proper procedure for securing SS prisoners?" The accusation hung between them like a loaded gun. Mueller forced himself to remain calm, even as his mind raced through contingencies. These men were more dangerous than he'd initially assumed, not because of their physical capabilities, but because they were piecing together truths he'd spent 2 years burying. Klaus looked between Ernst and Mueller with growing confusion. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Ernst said slowly, "that our captor isn't the simple farmer he pretends to be. Are you Heinrich?" The use of his first name was deliberate provocation. Mueller picked up the blade again, testing its edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood welled up, bright red against weathered skin. "Even if your wild theories held water," Mueller said, "what would you propose? That I cut you free and we all march to the nearest Allied command post together?" "The documents name specific Nazi officials who've been in secret contact with Allied intelligence," Klaus said, his voice gaining strength. "People in positions to sabotage the Reich from within. If we could get that information to the right people—" Weber laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand, do you, boy? There is no we. There's only dead Germans and deader Germans." But Mueller was studying Klaus's face, seeing something there that reminded him uncomfortably of himself at that age. Idealistic, desperate to believe that individual actions could matter in the face of overwhelming darkness. It was a dangerous sentiment for a man in his position to entertain. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another night of rain and reduced visibility. Whatever decision he made about these prisoners would have to come soon. Every hour they remained in his barn increased the risk of discovery. And if Ernst was right about the documents, Mueller might be holding the key to ending the war, or signing his own death warrant. The radio crackled to life at precisely 11:30, just as Mueller had predicted. Static filled the barn before a voice emerged, speaking rapid German that made the 3 prisoners straighten against their bonds. Thomas adjusted the frequency with practiced precision, his calloused fingers moving over the dials with an expertise that contradicted his simple farmer facade. The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, demanding a status report. Mueller's eyes widened as he watched Thomas respond in flawless German, his accent carrying the subtle inflections of someone who had spent considerable time in Bavaria. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough to confirm what Mueller had suspected. This was no ordinary farmer, and they had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple prisoner-of-war situation. "Interessant," Thomas murmured as he switched off the radio. He turned back to his captives, his demeanor shifted entirely. Gone was the hesitant uncertainty of a rural man thrust into extraordinary circumstances. In its place stood someone with the bearing of a professional, someone accustomed to deception and danger. "Your handler is quite concerned about the missed check-ins," Thomas said, pacing slowly before the 3 men. "Operation Valkyrie's timeline has been accelerated. They're moving forward with or without your intelligence." Brenner's face went ashen. "How do you know about Valkyrie?" Thomas completed the question with a thin smile. "Because, gentlemen, you're not the only ones with secrets. The question now is whether you want to be remembered as the men who helped save the fatherland, or as the ones who let it burn while clinging to misplaced loyalty." The barn door creaked open, and a woman entered, not the simple farm wife Thomas had mentioned, but someone whose bearing matched his own transformation. She was tall, angular, with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. Her clothing was practical but well-tailored, and she moved with the fluid efficiency of someone trained in violence. "The perimeter is secure," she reported in accented English. "No signs of pursuit, but there's increased radio chatter from the garrison. They're asking questions." Thomas nodded. "How long do we have?" 6 hours, perhaps 8, if we're fortunate." Mueller found his voice. "Who are you people?" The woman studied him with calculating eyes. "We're the ones trying to prevent your country from destroying itself and taking half of Europe with it. The real question is whether you have the courage to help us." She moved to a wooden crate in the corner, producing documents that made Brenner gasp audibly. Maps of Berlin, detailed floor plans of government buildings, and photographs of high-ranking Nazi officials, some marked with red X's that left little doubt about their fate. "The resistance has been planning this for months," she continued, spreading the papers where all 3 men could see them. "But your unit's intelligence about the bunker fortifications, the guard rotations, the communication protocols, that could mean the difference between success and a massacre." Hoffman, who had remained silent since his earlier outburst, leaned forward as much as his bonds allowed. "You're asking us to commit treason." "I'm asking you to help end a war that's already lost," Thomas replied sharply. "Your own intelligence confirms it. The Atlantic Wall is failing, the Eastern Front is collapsing, and your Führer is more concerned with his fantasies than reality. The question isn't whether Germany will fall, but how many more will die before it does." The weight of his words settled over the barn like a shroud. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old wooden structure and making the shadows dance in the lamplight. Mueller looked at his companions, seeing his own internal struggle reflected in their faces. They had trained for many scenarios, but not for this, being forced to choose between their oath and their conscience in a candlelit barn by people who seemed to know their mission better than they did themselves. "If we help you," Mueller said slowly, "what guarantee do we have that this isn't some elaborate interrogation technique, that you won't simply extract what you need and dispose of us?" The woman and Thomas exchanged a look that spoke of long partnership and shared secrets. "No guarantees," Thomas admitted. "But consider this. If we wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. If we simply wanted information, there are far more efficient methods than philosophical debates. We need your willing cooperation because this mission requires precision, timing, and trust." He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In 12 hours, certain events will be set in motion that cannot be undone. Your intelligence could save hundreds of lives and potentially end this war months sooner. But only if you choose to trust that some causes transcend national boundaries." The radio crackled again, another voice cutting through the static. This time, none of them needed translation. The urgency was universal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every footstep sound like thunder. Heinrich worked methodically in the pre-dawn darkness, checking the perimeter of his property one final time before the sun could betray any evidence of the previous night's activities. The three Germans sat bound in his kitchen now, nursing cups of ersatz coffee that tasted more like burnt acorns than anything resembling the real thing. "Your English is too perfect," Weber said, studying Heinrich over the rim of his cup. "No farmer speaks like you do." Heinrich paused in his examination of muddy boot prints near the barn entrance. "And your story about escaping from a prisoner transport is too convenient. Real escapees don't carry forged documents of that quality." The younger prisoner, Mueller, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We told you the truth about Bernhardt, every word." "Perhaps." Heinrich entered the kitchen and took his place at the scarred wooden table. "But truth has many layers, doesn't it? Like an onion. Each one makes you weep a little more." Richter, who had remained silent since his initial confession, suddenly spoke. "You're OSS." It wasn't a question. Heinrich met the man's steady gaze without flinching. Around them, the old farmhouse seemed to hold its breath. "Office of Strategic Services," Weber breathed. "American intelligence." "The accent," Richter continued, his voice gaining strength. "Midwest American, carefully modulated but not quite perfect. The way you move, too controlled for a farmer. And this place..." He gestured around the kitchen with its deliberately shabby furnishings. "It's a safe house." Heinrich stood slowly and walked to the window. Through the glass, he could see the first pale fingers of dawn creeping across the fields. In 6 hours, his handler would expect a radio check-in. In 12, he was supposed to rendezvous with a resistance cell operating out of the village church. The three Germans had complicated everything. "My name is Thomas Mitchell," he said finally. "Captain, United States Army, temporarily assigned to OSS operations in occupied France. This farm has been my cover for 8 months." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Mueller laughed bitterly. "Mein Gott. We flee from one intelligence service into the hands of another. The difference," Mitchell said, turning back to face them, "is that I'm not trying to kill you. Yet." Weber leaned forward. "Then you understand what Bernhardt represents. The Americans must know about the corruption in your intelligence networks. I understand that 3 men claiming to be German officers have told me a story about a Nazi spy ring that conveniently explains why they're running from their own people." Mitchell's voice hardened. "What I don't understand is why I shouldn't turn you over to the local resistance and let them sort out whether you're telling the truth." Richter reached slowly into his jacket, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it carefully on the table. "Because of this..." Mitchell examined the documents without touching them. Even from a distance, he could see they bore official Wehrmacht seals and signatures. Code names, operational details, financial records. If authentic, the papers represented an intelligence windfall of extraordinary value. "Bernhardt's network," Weber explained. "Names, locations, communication protocols. We managed to photograph his files before we had to run. Including," Mueller added quietly, "the identity of his primary contact in American intelligence." That got Mitchell's attention. He moved closer to the table, finally picking up one of the photographs. The image showed a typed document with a partially visible letterhead and what appeared to be a signature at the bottom. "Someone codenamed Phoenix," Richter said. "High-level access to OSS operations throughout Western Europe. Bernhardt has been feeding him information for over a year." Mitchell's blood chilled. Phoenix was the codename for Colonel James Hawthorne, his own commanding officer and the architect of at least a dozen ongoing OSS operations, the man who had personally briefed him for this assignment. "This could be fabricated," Mitchell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It could be," Weber agreed. "But ask yourself, how many of your recent operations have failed? How many agents have been compromised? How many resistance cells have been rolled up by the Gestapo just when they were about to achieve something significant?" The questions hit too close to home. The Rouen network, eliminated 3 weeks ago, the failed sabotage of the railway bridge near Caen, the arrest of Father Bernard, whose only crime had been providing sanctuary to Allied airmen. Mitchell set the photograph down carefully. Outside, a rooster crowed, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of German patrol vehicles beginning their morning rounds. The day was starting, and with it all the dangers that daylight brought to this deadly game of shadows and deception. He looked at the 3 Germans, bound and exhausted, but somehow managing to maintain their dignity even in captivity. Either they were the most sophisticated enemy agents he had ever encountered, or they were exactly what they claimed to be, reluctant allies bearing a terrible truth. "Tell me about Bernhardt," he said. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Heinrich made his way to the radio hidden beneath the loose floorboards of the chicken coop. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the frequency, muscle memory guiding him to a channel he hadn't used in months. The static crackled, then cleared. "Raven's Nest. This is Shepard," he whispered into the microphone, using the old codes that felt foreign on his tongue after so long. The response came quickly, too quickly. "Shepard, your signal has been dark for 14 weeks. Status report required immediately." Heinrich closed his eyes. 14 weeks of peace, of pretending to be just another broken farmer trying to survive in a world gone mad. 14 weeks of believing he might have escaped the web that had ensnared him since 1943. "I have a situation requiring immediate extraction and analysis. 3 packages, high value, claiming Operation Bernhard compromised. Requesting instructions." A pause, then confirm package origin and contents. German military, SS Oberführer rank among them. They're talking about counterfeit currency, infiltration of Allied command structure, claims of American officials on payroll. Heinrich's voice dropped lower. They know about the Vatican connection. The silence stretched so long, Heinrich wondered if the connection had been lost. When the voice returned, it carried a different tone, harder, more urgent. "Shepard, you are to maintain position and secure packages until contact arrives. Estimated 12 hours. Under no circumstances allow package contents to reach outside parties. Do you understand?" "Understood, but no deviations, Shepard. The operation depends on containment." The radio went dead. Heinrich stared at the silent device, his mind racing. 12 hours. They'd send someone, probably Marlowe or one of the other cleanup specialists, men who asked no questions and left no witnesses. He'd worked with them before, back when his conscience had been more pliable and his loyalty less complicated. But that was before he'd found some semblance of peace in this forgotten corner of Ohio. Before he'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could disappear into the role of Heinrich Mueller, simple farmer. Before he'd grown tired of the shadows and the lies and the endless dance of espionage that had consumed his adult life. He replaced the floorboards carefully and scattered fresh straw over them. The chickens pecked around his boots, oblivious to the gravity of what had just transpired. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, Heinrich caught sight of movement in the barn's hayloft window. Anna's pale face appeared briefly before vanishing again. She'd been watching. How much had she heard? Inside the barn, the atmosphere had shifted during his absence. The 3 Germans sat in a loose circle, their bonds loosened enough to allow more comfortable positioning. Anna stood near the workbench, the Luger in her hands pointed steadily at Richter. "They tried to negotiate," she said without looking at Heinrich. "Offered me money, protection, passage to South America. Richter seems to think I'm someone important." Heinrich studied the Oberführer's face. "What did you tell him?" "That I'm just a farm girl who's tired of men trying to control her." Anna's smile held no warmth. "But he doesn't believe me." "Do you, Herr Richter?" Richter's grey eyes moved between Anna and Heinrich. "Your accent isn't American. Hungarian, perhaps? Or Czech?" He shifted forward slightly. "And you, Herr Mueller, if that is indeed your name, handle that rifle like someone with military training, formal training." Heinrich felt the walls closing in. Lots of men learned to shoot in the war. But not like that. I've seen how professional soldiers move, how they think. You assessed threats, established fields of fire, secured prisoners with textbook precision. Richter's voice gained confidence. So the question becomes, who are you really working for? Before Heinrich could respond, Anna spoke. Tell them about the radio. The words hit like a physical blow. Heinrich's eyes snapped to her face, searching for any sign of betrayal or manipulation. But her expression remained neutral, almost curious. What radio? Steiner asked quickly. Heinrich felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. Anna knew. Somehow, she'd discovered his secret, and now she was forcing his hand. But why? What game was she playing? The one hidden in the chicken coop, Anna continued calmly. The one he just used to call someone about our 3 friends here. Richter's face transformed, suspicion giving way to something approaching satisfaction. Ah, so we're all players in the same game, just wearing different uniforms. Heinrich's mind raced through possibilities. Anna had given him an opening, but he couldn't see where it led. The smart play was to maintain his cover, stick to the farmer's story until help arrived. But Anna's revelation had changed the dynamics completely. 12 hours, he said finally, meeting each of their gazes in turn. That's how long we have before someone comes to collect you. The question is whether you'll still be breathing when they arrive. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the barn's eaves like a broken metronome, marking time toward an inevitable conclusion. Thomas stood in the doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame as he watched the 3 Germans, huddled around the makeshift table where maps and documents lay scattered like fallen leaves. "You understand what you're asking of me," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. The accent he'd carefully buried for 15 years threatened to surface with each word. "If even half of what you've told me is true." Hauptmann Weber looked up from the photographs, his face gaunt in the lamplight. "It is all true, Herr." He caught himself, studying Thomas with new intensity. Or perhaps I should say, Oberst. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Thomas felt the familiar weight of his old identity pressing against the simple farmer's mask he'd worn for so long. The other prisoners, Richter and the young radio operator, Klaus, had stopped their whispered conversation to stare at him. "That man is dead," Thomas said finally. "He died in the rubble of Berlin with everything else." "Did he?" Weber's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because the man who built that hidden compartment under the floorboards, who recognized military-grade encryption at a glance, who knew exactly how to search us for concealed weapons, that man received extensive training somewhere." Thomas stepped fully into the barn, pulling the door closed behind him. The gesture felt like sealing a tomb. "What do you want from me, Weber?" "The same thing you want, I suspect, to prevent an abomination." Weber gestured to the documents spread before them. "Project Lazarus isn't just about resurrecting dead soldiers. It's about creating an army that cannot be stopped, cannot be reasoned with, cannot surrender. They're planning to deploy it in Korea first, a test run before the real war begins." "Real war?" Klaus looked up from his radio equipment, his young face pale. "The Americans aren't the only ones working on this technology, sir. Our sources indicate the Soviets have their own version, and the Chinese—" His voice broke. "They're using prisoners from their camps as test subjects." Thomas felt ice form in his chest. He'd seen enough horrors in his lifetime, participated in enough atrocities to last 1,000 lifetimes. The farmer's life he'd built here was supposed to be his penance, his quiet retreat from a world gone mad. But the world, it seemed, had found him anyway. "The facility is 50 kilometers north." Richter spoke for the first time since their initial interrogation, his voice hoarse from his injuries. "Hidden in the mountains, disguised as a mining operation. But the real work happens underground. Laboratories, holding cells, crematoriums." The word hung in the air like smoke. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering other crematoriums, other laboratories where human beings had been reduced to test subjects and ash. He told himself those days were over, that such madness could never return. He'd been a fool. How many people know the truth? Thomas asked. Inside the project? Perhaps a dozen at most. But they're all true believers, convinced they're creating the ultimate deterrent against communist expansion. Weber's hands trembled as he lifted a photograph, a grainy image of what looked like surgical equipment in an underground chamber. They call it patriotic duty. Thomas had heard those words before in different languages from different madmen. The justifications never changed, only the flags they were wrapped in. You're asking me to help you destroy it. We're asking you to help us save what's left of our humanity, Weber said. Whatever we were, whatever we did in the war, this is our chance to do something right. Thomas walked to the window, peering through the grimy glass at his fields stretching toward the distant mountains. Somewhere up there, in hidden chambers carved from stone, science was being perverted once again in service of war. How many more would die if he did nothing? How many more would become something worse than dead? There's a checkpoint at Miller's Creek, he said without turning around. Guard rotation changes at midnight. The patrol route follows the old mining road, but there's a deer path through the woods that bypasses the main gate. He could hear them moving behind him, gathering their materials with renewed urgency. These men who had been enemies were now something else, fellow travelers on a path that led either to redemption or damnation. Why? Weber asked quietly. Why are you helping us? Thomas touched the window glass, feeling the cold seep through his fingertips. In the reflection, he saw not the simple farmer he'd pretended to be, but the soldier he'd tried so hard to forget, scarred by choices that still haunted his dreams. Because some sins, he said, can only be washed clean with blood. The radio crackled to life at 0400 hours, its static cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Heinrich Mueller sat upright in the farmhouse kitchen, his coffee growing cold as the coded transmission filtered through the atmospheric interference. 3 short bursts, followed by a pause, then 2 long tones. The message he'd been dreading for 3 years. Operation Valkyrie compromised. Extract immediately. His hand trembled as he reached for the frequency dial, spinning it to confirm the authentication code. The response came through clear and urgent. His cover was blown. Someone in Berlin had talked, and his carefully constructed identity as a simple Iowa farmer was unraveling faster than he could contain it. Through the kitchen window, he could see the barn where the 3 German prisoners remained bound. They'd been unconscious for hours now, the sedative he'd administered working its way through their systems. But they wouldn't stay that way much longer, and when they woke, they'd have questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Not yet. The documents they'd carried painted a picture that defied everything the world believed about the war's progression. Project Bernhard wasn't just about counterfeiting Allied currency, it was the financial backbone of something far more sinister. The prisoner named Klaus had mentioned a 4th site, somewhere in the American Midwest, where the operation's final phase was already underway. Heinrich, or rather the man who had assumed that identity, paced the small kitchen, weighing his options. The original Heinrich Mueller had died in a bombing raid outside Munich in 1943. His death certificate had been conveniently lost in the chaos, allowing British intelligence to craft the perfect deep cover identity. For 3 years, he'd lived as a reclusive farmer, monitoring German radio transmissions and reporting back to London through carefully coded weather reports to the local agricultural station. But the war was ending, and with it, his usefulness. The extraction signal meant his handlers wanted him out before questions arose about how a simple farmer had survived so well during rationing, or why his German was so fluent when neighbors occasionally heard him talking to himself in the fields. The floorboards creaked overhead. Someone was moving in the house. He froze, hand instinctively reaching for the Luger hidden beneath the kitchen table. The farmhouse should have been empty. He'd lived alone since assuming the identity, maintaining the fiction that Heinrich Mueller was a widower whose sons had died in the Pacific. Footsteps descended the stairs, slow and deliberate. Through the doorway he caught a glimpse of a figure in a dark coat, moving with the practiced silence of someone accustomed to moving unseen. The visitor appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Heinrich's blood ran cold. "Hello, Thomas," the woman said, using his real name for the first time in 3 years. "We need to talk." Margaret Shaw looked exactly as she had when he'd last seen her in London, before the war transformed them both into different people. Her auburn hair was shorter now, styled in the practical fashion of American women, but her green eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made her one of the SOE's most effective operatives. "I thought you were dead," he said, not lowering the gun he'd drawn from its hiding place. "Reports of my death were carefully constructed." She stepped into the kitchen, hands visible and empty. "Just like your new identity. Though I must say, you've played the part of a Midwestern farmer remarkably well. The neighbors speak quite fondly of the helpful German immigrant who keeps to himself. How long have you been watching?" "Long enough to know about your 3 guests in the barn. Long enough to see you photograph their documents before sedating them." Margaret pulled out a chair and sat without invitation. "The question is, what do you plan to do with what you've learned?" Heinrich kept the gun trained on her while his mind raced. Margaret's presence here couldn't be coincidence. If she was alive, if she'd been operating in America while he thought she'd died in occupied France, then everything he believed about his mission might be wrong. The extraction signal came from me, she interrupted. "Thomas, what those prisoners told you is true, but it's not the whole truth. Project Bernhard was never just about currency manipulation. It was about creating a financial network that could survive the war's end, ensuring that certain elements could maintain power regardless of which flags flew over European capitals. The implications hit him like a physical blow. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that some conspiracies run deeper than nationality. Some wars continue long after the peace treaties are signed." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And some of our own people have been playing for the wrong side since the beginning." Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the Iowa landscape. In the barn, 3 German prisoners would soon wake to find their world forever changed. But here in the kitchen, Thomas realized that his own world had already shifted beneath his feet in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The radio crackled to life in the pre-dawn darkness, its static-filled transmission piercing the tense silence of the farmhouse kitchen. Heinrich's hands trembled as he adjusted the frequency, his weathered fingers dancing across the dials with practiced precision. "Shadow network compromised," a voice whispered through the interference. "Extraction impossible. Underground assets burned. You are alone." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The confirmation of their worst fears hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. He watched Heinrich's shoulders sag as the weight of abandonment settled over the old man like a burial shroud. 40 years, Heinrich muttered, switching off the radio. 40 years of loyalty, and they cut us loose like diseased cattle. From the barn came the muffled sounds of their prisoners, Klaus, Werner, and Dietrich, still bound but increasingly restless. The sedative Thomas had administered hours earlier was wearing thin, and their voices carried a desperate urgency that made his skin crawl. "We need to hear them out," Thomas said, pouring coffee from the pot that had grown bitter with the passing hours. "Whatever they're hiding, it's bigger than just escaped POWs." Heinrich's laugh was hollow, devoid of any humor. "You still don't understand, do you? Those men in my barn aren't prisoners of war, they're hunters, and we've just become their prey." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He set down his coffee cup with shaking hands, the ceramic chattering against the wooden table. "What are you talking about? The uniforms, the documentation, all of it's fabricated. They're Ahnenerbe operatives, Thomas. SS Forschung's unit specializing in unusual acquisitions." Heinrich's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They've been tracking me for months." Through the kitchen window, the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn. In that growing light, Thomas could see the full scope of their predicament. If Heinrich was right, if these weren't simply escaped prisoners but active enemy agents, then everything had changed. The documents they mentioned, Thomas pressed. The ones hidden in your cellar, what are they really? Heinrich was quiet for so long that Thomas thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible secrets. Operation Bernhard was just the beginning. What I helped steal. It wasn't just currency plates. We intercepted the complete files on America's atomic research program, every calculation, every blueprint, every scientist involved. Information that could have changed the entire course of the war. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them as the magnitude of this confession sank in. Thomas understood now why Heinrich had chosen this isolated existence, why he'd hidden himself away from the world. He wasn't just a defector. He was carrying secrets that could still reshape global politics decades after the war's end. Jesus Christ, Thomas breathed. Do you know what this means? If those documents fell into the wrong hands? They won't, Heinrich said firmly. I've kept them safe all these years, and I'll destroy them before I let the Reich claim them. A sharp bang from the barn interrupted their conversation, followed by angry German voices. Their prisoners were becoming increasingly agitated, and Thomas realized they were running out of time. They're not just here for the documents, he said, the pieces finally clicking into place. They're here for you. You're the only person who knows where everything is hidden. Heinrich nodded grimly. The Ahnenerbe has long arms, Thomas. Even after the war's official end, they continue their work in the shadows. They've been systematically hunting down anyone who possessed critical Reich secrets. Another crash from the barn, followed by the splintering of wood. The men were working themselves free. We have to move, Thomas said, grabbing his rifle from beside the door. How long do we have before they break loose? Not long enough, Heinrich replied, reaching for a shotgun mounted above the fireplace. But there's something else you need to know. The reason I chose this farm, this specific location, it wasn't random. Thomas paused, his hand on the door handle. What do you mean? These coordinates were designated as a dead drop site. If anything ever went wrong, if the network ever collapsed, this was where the final insurance policy would be activated. Heinrich's eyes were dark with purpose. Thomas, we're not just sitting on stolen documents, we're sitting on the trigger for a weapon that could bring down governments. The sound of snapping rope and German curses drifted across the farmyard. Dawn was breaking in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In that apocalyptic light, Thomas could see their captives emerging from the barn, no longer bound, no longer helpless. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and Thomas wasn't sure who the hunters really were anymore. The radio crackled to life at 0347 hours, filling Heinrich's hidden basement laboratory with static before clearing to reveal the voice he'd been dreading to hear again. Blackbird, this is Nest. Status report overdue. Respond immediately. Heinrich stared at the transmitter, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for the microphone. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the prisoners in his barn. 3 days since his carefully constructed world had begun unraveling. The voice belonged to Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, his former handler in the Ahnenerbe, the SS research division that had sent him to America 5 years ago under deep cover. Nest, this is Blackbird, Heinrich finally responded, his German accent thickening despite years of practice with his American farmer persona. Mission parameters have evolved. A pause. Then Richter's voice, sharp as winter steel, evolved how, old friend? Our sources indicate unusual activity in your sector. 3 of our assets went dark near your position. Heinrich glanced toward the ceiling, knowing that somewhere above him, those 3 assets were likely still unconscious in his root cellar where he'd moved them after young Tommy Patterson had left. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had spent years hunting Jewish refugees across occupied Europe was now harboring German fugitives. I have them, Heinrich admitted. But Klaus, what they've told me. If it's true, then everything we believed about the war's end was a lie. Another pause. longer this time. When Richter spoke again, his voice carried a dangerous edge. You will secure the assets and await extraction. A team is already en route to your position. No. The word escaped Heinrich's lips before he could stop it. In the silence that followed, he could almost hear Richter's surprise crackling through the radio waves. Did you just refuse a direct order, Heinrich? Heinrich closed his eyes, thinking of the terror in Anna Hoffman's voice as she described the massacre at the research facility. He thought of the documents they'd shown him. Documents that proved Project Kronos wasn't just theoretical research into time manipulation, but an active operation that had been used to alter key moments of the war. The Battle of Stalingrad, D-Day, the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, all of it orchestrated by a secret cabal that had been playing both sides, ensuring the war's outcome served their purposes. The woman, Anna Hoffman, she was at Facility 7 when it was destroyed. She has proof that our own people have been manipulating events. Klaus, they've been sacrificing German soldiers' entire divisions for some greater plan that goes beyond the Reich. Heinrich, listen carefully. Richter's voice took on a paternal tone that Heinrich remembered from their early days together in the Tibetan expeditions. The war damaged many minds. These prisoners are clearly delusional. The facility they claim to have escaped from doesn't exist. There is no Project Kronos. But Heinrich had spent the last 72 hours studying the documents, cross-referencing them with intelligence reports he'd gathered during his cover mission. Too many pieces fit together. The unexplained German tactical errors, the perfectly timed Allied victories, the mysterious deaths of generals who'd questioned high command. Then, explain the temporal displacement equipment I've seen, Heinrich said quietly. Explain the photographs of events that haven't happened yet. Explain why Anna Hoffman knew about Operation Bernhard 3 weeks before it was authorized. The radio went silent for nearly a minute. When Richter returned, his voice had changed completely. Cold, calculating, stripped of all pretense of friendship. Heinrich, you've served the fatherland faithfully, but your isolation has clearly affected your judgment. The extraction team has orders to bring you home, along with the assets. Consider it a medical leave. Heinrich laughed bitterly. He knew what medical leave meant in SS parlance. And if I refuse, then you'll be classified as a rogue agent. The consequences of that classification, I trust I don't need to explain. Through the basement's small window, Heinrich could see the first pale traces of dawn breaking across his cornfields. Somewhere out there, Tommy Patterson was probably feeding his livestock, unaware that his simple act of kindness 3 days ago had set in motion events that could reshape history. Heinrich made his decision. Klaus, I've spent 5 years in this American wilderness thinking about the things we did, the people we hunted, the experiments we conducted. I told myself it was for a greater good, for the advancement of human knowledge. He paused, fingering the silver SS ring he still wore despite everything. But if what these prisoners claim is true, then we weren't serving humanity or even Germany. We were pawns in someone else's game. Heinrich. The extraction team can come, Heinrich interrupted, but they'll find only an abandoned farm. And Klaus? If I discover you're part of this conspiracy, if you've known about Kronos all along. He let the threat hang in the air. He switched off the radio, severing his last connection to the life he'd known. Outside, a rooster crowed, welcoming another day in a world that was far more complex and dangerous than anyone imagined. The sound of engines growing louder pulled Heinrich from his frantic examination of the documents. Through the barn's weathered slats, he could see dust clouds rising from the valley road. 3, maybe 4 vehicles approaching fast. His trained eye caught the glint of military markings even at this distance. They found us, Klaus whispered, his face pale despite the barn's dim lighting. Heinrich's mind raced through possibilities. The approaching convoy could be German forces loyal to the conspiracy, American intelligence, or worse, SS units sent to eliminate all witnesses. In any case, their time had run out. The documents. Heinrich said, grabbing the most critical papers from the scattered pile. "We need to preserve what matters most." Ernst stepped forward, his scholarly instincts overriding his fear. "The authentication codes, the financial transfers, and the names. Those 3 folders contain everything needed to expose the network." Heinrich nodded, stuffing the papers into a leather satchel he retrieved from behind a feed barrel. The approaching engines were close enough now that he could distinguish the rumble of heavy trucks from lighter reconnaissance vehicles. "There's a root cellar beneath the farmhouse," he said, "built during the last Indian raids, with a tunnel that emerges near the creek. If we move now—" Klaus's voice was firm. "They'll search everything, hunt us down within hours." He looked directly at Heinrich, but they might not expect the hunter to become the hunted. The old farmer understood immediately. Klaus was suggesting they split up, one group drawing attention while another escaped with the evidence. It was sound, tactical thinking, but Heinrich had spent too many years running to sacrifice others for his survival. "I won't leave you to face this alone," Heinrich said. "You're not leaving us," Ernst interjected, surprising them both. "You're completing the mission. These documents in the wrong hands mean everything we've discovered dies with us. In the right hands—" he gestured toward the satchel. "They could change everything." The engines stopped. Through gaps in the barn walls, Heinrich could see uniformed figures deploying around the property. They moved with military precision, but their uniforms were American. That narrowed the possibilities, but didn't necessarily improve their odds. Klaus moved to the barn's side window, peering carefully through the dust-caked glass. 6 men, 2 officers, 4 enlisted. They're setting up a perimeter, but they're not rushing the buildings. They want to talk first. An amplified voice echoed across the farmyard. "This is Colonel Mitchell, United States Army Intelligence. We know you're here. We're not your enemy, but we need to verify certain information. Come out with your hands visible." Heinrich felt a cold recognition settle in his stomach. Colonel Mitchell, he'd heard that name before, in whispered conversations among displaced persons in the refugee camps. Mitchell ran operations too sensitive for official channels, the kind that dealt with former Nazis who had something valuable to offer. "Operation Paperclip," he murmured. "What?" Klaus asked. "American program. They've been recruiting German scientists, intelligence officers, anyone with useful knowledge, overlooking certain past affiliations in exchange for cooperation against the Soviets." Ernst's face hardened. "So they might want to bury this conspiracy, not expose it. Can't have it revealed that American industrialists were hedging their bets with Nazi gold." The amplified voice came again. "We have authorization to bring you in safely, but patience has limits. You have 2 minutes to respond." Heinrich made his decision. He handed the satchel to Klaus. "The tunnel leads to Millfield Creek, follows the waterline southeast for about 2 miles before reaching the old logging road. There's a cache buried under the 3rd lightning-struck oak, supplies, money, contact information for people who can help. Heinrich, listen carefully. In Chicago, there's a journalist named Sarah Chen at the Tribune. She's been investigating corporate ties to German industry. She can be trusted with this." Klaus gripped the satchel tightly. "What about you?" "I'm going to give them what they expect to find. A frightened old farmer with a story about finding prisoners in his barn. Buy you time to reach Chicago." Ernst stepped forward. "I'll stay too. Back up your story, add credibility. But Klaus needs to go. He's the only one who understands all the financial connections." Klaus looked between them, clearly torn. Outside, they could hear boots moving closer to the barn. 1 minute. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried a harder edge now. "Go," Heinrich urged. "The cellar entrance is hidden behind the potato bins in the southwest corner of the farmhouse basement. Move fast, stay low along the creek bed." Klaus nodded reluctantly, securing the satchel across his shoulder. "If I make it to Chicago, if this gets exposed, what then?" Heinrich smiled grimly. "Then maybe some good comes from all this darkness." Klaus slipped out the barn's rear door, staying low as he moved toward the farmhouse. Heinrich watched until he disappeared, then turned to Ernst. "Ready to meet Colonel Mitchell?" Ernst straightened his shoulders. "Let's see what kind of deal he's offering." The barn doors opened to reveal armed soldiers silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The coded transmission crackled through Heinrich's radio as dawn broke over the farm. 3 sharp bursts, then silence, the signal they'd been waiting for, or dreading. Heinrich's hands trembled as he adjusted the frequency, his weathered face pale in the amber morning light filtering through the barn windows. "What does it mean?" Klaus whispered, his voice hoarse from their sleepless night of planning. Heinrich's eyes met Thomas's across the cramped space. "Berlin knows we're here." The weight of those words settled over them like a shroud. Thomas felt his carefully constructed world, both the farmer's peaceful existence and the elaborate deception he'd maintained, beginning to crumble, somewhere in the distance. He could hear the low rumble of engines, too many engines. "How long do we have?" Franz asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be reassuring. Thomas moved to the window, peering through a gap in the weathered boards. Dust clouds rose from the valley road, vehicles approaching fast. His trained eye counted at least 6, possibly 8 vehicles. Military convoy formation. His pulse quickened as years of dormant instinct surged back to life. 20 minutes, maybe less. He turned back to the Germans, his decision crystallizing. "Heinrich, can you transmit to London? You're going to warn them." Klaus's voice carried equal parts hope and disbelief. "I'm going to finish this." Thomas grabbed the leather satchel containing the documents they'd spent hours reviewing. The proof of Operation Bernhard's scope was damning enough, but the lists of American collaborators, politicians, military officers, business leaders, would devastate the Allied power structure if they fell into the wrong hands. Heinrich's fingers flew over the radio controls. London frequency locked. "But Thomas—" He paused, studying the farmer's face. "Who are you really?" The question hung in the air as the engine noise grew louder. Thomas had maintained his cover for so long that the truth felt foreign on his tongue. "Major Thomas Hartwell, British intelligence, assigned to this sector 3 years ago." Franz laughed bitterly. "So we've been prisoners of a spy this entire time. You've been protected by one." Thomas's voice carried an edge of steel. "The SS unit heading this way won't show you the same courtesy I have." Heinrich successfully established contact with London, passing Thomas a pair of headphones. The familiar clipped tones of his handler's voice cut through the static, but there was no time for proper protocols. "Nightingale, this is Shepard. Priority Alpha transmission. Operation Bernhard compromised. Full documentation in my possession. Requesting immediate extraction for 4. The response was swift and devastating. "Negative on extraction. Nightingale. Sector too hot. Destroy all evidence and maintain cover." Thomas ripped off the headphones, his jaw clenched. "They're cutting us loose." The sound of vehicles reached the farmyard now. Doors slamming, harsh German voices shouting orders. Klaus peered through another window, his face grim. SS Oberfuhrer Mueller himself. "They're not here for a friendly chat." "The tunnels," Heinrich said suddenly. "Klaus mentioned tunnels yesterday." "Drainage system from the old mill," Klaus confirmed. "Runs beneath the property. Haven't been used in years, but they might still be passable." Thomas's mind raced through options. The tunnels could provide escape, but they'd need time to destroy the evidence first. And leaving meant abandoning everything he'd built here, every carefully maintained detail of his cover life. Franz grabbed his arm. "Whatever you're thinking, decide quickly. They're surrounding the barn." Through the gaps in the boards, Thomas could see black uniforms moving with military precision. Muller's voice carried across the yard, ordering his men into position. The Oberfuhrer had come prepared for a siege. "Heinrich, transmit everything to London, all of it. Klaus, Franz, show me these tunnels." Thomas pulled out a steel lighter and moved toward the stacks of forged documents they'd organized. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they breach the doors." "Wait." Klaus caught his wrist. "Those documents, they prove what Berlin was planning. Without them, who's going to believe our word against the Reich's official story?" The pounding started on the barn doors, heavy, rhythmic strikes that would splinter the aged wood within minutes. Heinrich's radio continued crackling with coded transmissions as he fed their intelligence to London, but the process was agonizingly slow. "Thomas Hartwell!" Mueller's voice boomed across the farmyard. "We know you're in there. Surrender the prisoners and the documents, and we might let you live." The sound of his real name spoken aloud sent a chill down Thomas's spine. His cover wasn't just blown, it had been obliterated. Someone in London had talked, or Berlin's intelligence network was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Franz pointed toward a section of the barn floor where loose boards revealed a dark opening below. "There. But once we're down there, there's no coming back." Thomas looked around the barn one final time. At his tools, his carefully maintained facade of simple farm life, at these 3 German soldiers who'd become unlikely allies in their shared race against time. The pounding on the doors grew louder. "Then we go forward." The radio crackled to life at precisely 0300 hours, its static-filled transmission cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the farmhouse. Heinrich's fingers trembled as he adjusted the frequency, the familiar cadence of his handler's voice emerging from the white noise like a ghost from his past. "Sparrow, report status of package delivery." Heinrich stared at the microphone, his throat constricting. The package, Operation Nachtigall, the 3 men bound in his barn, represented the culmination of years of careful planning, a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of both the Nazi regime and Allied command. Men who knew too much, who had seen the secret communications, the backdoor negotiations, the shadow war being fought behind the official headlines. "Sparrow, do you copy?" His hand hovered over the transmit button. For 15 years, he had played his role perfectly. Heinrich Brenner, the reclusive German immigrant who had settled in rural Iowa after the Great War, a man broken by conflict, seeking only solitude and simple farm life. The neighbors had accepted his story, his carefully crafted identity. They had no idea that Heinrich Brenner had died in a muddy trench in 1918, or that the man who bore his name was something far more dangerous. The barn door creaked in the wind, and through the kitchen window he could see the faint outline of the structure where his 3 prisoners waited. Except they weren't his prisoners at all. They were his handlers, his lifeline to Berlin, and now they were compromised. Colonel Richter had explained it all during their first night in the barn, speaking in rapid German, while Heinrich maintained his facade of reluctant captor. The Allies had intercepted communications about Nachtigall. They knew about the sleeper cells, the deep cover agents placed throughout the American heartland. Worse, they knew about the contingency plan, the systematic elimination of anyone connected to the operation. "You have 24 hours, Richter had whispered urgently. "After that, the Abwehr will assume we're compromised. They'll send clean-up crews." Heinrich had nodded, understanding the implications. Clean-up crews meant death for everyone involved, including himself. The Nazi intelligence apparatus was nothing if not thorough in tying up loose ends. Now, with dawn approaching and the radio demanding answers, Heinrich faced an impossible choice. Report the mission's success and seal the death warrant for 3 men who had served the Reich faithfully, remain silent and trigger protocols that would bring assassins to his doorstep within hours. The kitchen door opened behind him and Sarah entered with careful steps. The local sheriff's deputy had been watching the farm since the incident with the supposed escaped prisoners. She had volunteered for the night shift, claiming concern for Heinrich's safety, but he had seen the calculation in her eyes, the way she studied his movements, catalogued his responses. "Couldn't sleep," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "Thought I heard something." The radio hissed with another transmission attempt. Heinrich reached over and switched it off, offering Sarah a weak smile. "Old habits. I listen to the overseas broadcasts sometimes. News from the homeland." "The homeland." Sarah's voice carried a subtle emphasis that made Heinrich's skin prickle. "Must be difficult hearing about the war, knowing your countrymen are fighting." "Former countrymen," Heinrich corrected, but the words felt hollow. "America is my home now." Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the wooden table. "Those men in your barn, they spoke German." It wasn't a question. Heinrich felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. "Many people speak German. It doesn't mean—" "One of them called you Oberst." The title hung in the air between them like an accusation. "That's Colonel, isn't it?" The silence stretched taut as a wire. Heinrich studied Sarah's face, seeing past the concerned deputy to something harder, more professional. The way she held herself, the positioning of her hands. She was ready for violence. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Sarah's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Counterintelligence Corps. We've been watching you for 6 months, Heinrich. Or should I say, Oberst Klaus Steiner of the Abwehr." The name hit him like a physical blow. Klaus Steiner, his real identity, buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it no longer existed. But somehow they had dug it up, traced the threads of his past through the careful maze of false documents and manufactured memories. "The 3 men in your barn aren't prisoners," Sarah continued, her voice gaining confidence. "They're your handlers. Operation Nachtigall was a trap, Steiner. We let them come to you." Heinrich's mind raced through the implications. If the Americans had known from the beginning, then everything. The failed escape, the desperate confessions, the urgent warnings about cleanup crews had been theater. A carefully orchestrated performance designed to extract information. Outside he could hear vehicles approaching, their engines cutting through the morning stillness. The real endgame was beginning, and Heinrich realized with crystalline clarity that everyone involved had been playing for stakes far higher than any of them had understood. The radio crackled back to life, but this time the voice spoke English. "Package secured. Begin extraction." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. Thomas felt the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders as he stared at the 3 Germans, their faces etched with the same exhaustion he'd carried for 27 years. "You know what those engines mean," Klaus said quietly. "They've found us." Through the barn's weathered slats, dust clouds rose on the horizon. Too many vehicles for a routine patrol. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in the same inevitable conclusion. The conspiracy they'd uncovered, the documents hidden beneath his floorboards, the truth about Operation Bernhard. It would all die here unless they acted now. "There's a root cellar beneath the farmhouse," Thomas said, surprising himself with the decision. "It connects to an old mine shaft that runs 2 miles east to the creek. My grandfather used it during Prohibition." Weber laughed bitterly. "The American farmer saves the Nazi prisoners. There's irony for you." "I'm not saving Nazis," Thomas replied, his voice steel. "I'm preserving the truth." The sound of engines grew louder. Thomas could distinguish at least 4 vehicles, maybe more. Through the barn window, he glimpsed the lead car, a black sedan that screamed government authority. Behind it, military jeeps kicked up clouds of Missouri dust. "The documents," Mueller said urgently. "What happens to them if we're captured?" Thomas had wondered the same thing. The evidence they'd compiled over 3 days of desperate collaboration, bank records, Nazi communications, names of American officials involved in the currency manipulation scheme, represented the only proof of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of both governments. Without it, the 3 Germans would simply disappear, labeled as escaped war criminals, while the truth died with them. "I've made copies," Thomas lied smoothly, "hidden in places they'll never find." It wasn't entirely false. He'd memorized key details, photographed crucial documents with his father's old camera. But the complete picture, the irrefutable evidence, existed only in the papers now stuffed inside an oilcloth bag beneath his kitchen floor. Klaus stepped forward, his bearing still military, despite 3 days of captivity. "Herr Kaufmann, that is your real name, isn't it? Why are you helping us?" Thomas paused at the barn door, listening to vehicles turning up his driveway. The question deserved an honest answer. Perhaps the first completely truthful words he'd spoken in decades. Because I've spent 27 years trying to forget what I learned in that bunker in Berlin. The things I saw, the documents I photographed for Allied intelligence, they painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond Nazi war crimes. American officials were involved in currency manipulation schemes that would have destabilized European reconstruction. When the war ended, certain people on both sides had every reason to bury that evidence. The Germans exchanged glances. Weber's expression had shifted from suspicion to something approaching understanding. "You were intelligence," Mueller said. "That's why you recognized our names, why you knew about Operation Bernhard." "Oh, yes," Thomas confirmed. "Until my handlers decided I'd learned too much. The car accident that supposedly killed Thomas Kaufmann in 1946, it was meant to be real. I survived, but Jacob Thomas died that day. I've been living his life ever since." Car doors slammed outside, heavy boots on gravel, voices shouting orders in English, definitely military, definitely organized. Through the window, Thomas counted 8 men in uniform, plus 2 in civilian suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of federal agents. "The tunnel entrance is behind the potato bin in the cellar," Thomas said rapidly. "Follow it east for exactly 1 mile, then take the left fork. It emerges in a thicket near Willow Creek. There's an old fishing cabin about half a mile downstream, abandoned but weather-tight. Hide there until tomorrow night, then follow the creek south to the railway bridge. Freight trains stop there for water." Klaus gripped his arm. "Come with us. They'll kill you once they realize what you know." Thomas shook his head. "I'm done running. Besides, someone needs to stay and destroy the evidence if this goes wrong." The sound of boots reached the porch. Thomas heard his front door splinter. They weren't bothering with warrants or courtesy. Shouts echoed from inside the house, men systematically searching rooms. "Go," Thomas whispered. "Now." The 3 Germans moved with surprising stealth toward the house, using the barn as cover. Thomas watched them disappear around the corner, heading for the cellar entrance. In the distance, one of the federal agents was directing soldiers to surround the property, but their focus remained on the obvious hiding places, the barn, the outbuildings, the fields. Thomas stepped into the sunlight, hands visible as armed men emerged from his violated home. The lead agent, a thin man with pale eyes and a Washington pallor, spotted him immediately. "Jacob Thomas?" the agent called out. "We need to talk." The pre-dawn silence shattered as headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the farmhouse in stark white beams. Heinrich Mueller, who had been Thomas Brennan for 27 years, stood at his kitchen window watching the convoy of black vehicles snake up his gravel drive. His weathered hands remained steady as he poured himself one final cup of coffee, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, Klaus, Werner and Dietrich sat bound to kitchen chairs, their faces masks of resignation and bitter satisfaction. The documents that could have rewritten history lay scattered across the wooden table, photographs, classified reports, witness testimonies, all of it worthless now. "You knew they would come," Klaus said quietly. Heinrich nodded, not turning from the window. "The moment you 3 appeared in my barn, this outcome became inevitable." He took a slow sip of coffee, though I confess I hoped we might have more time. The vehicles stopped in a semicircle around the house. Car doors slammed in rapid succession, and Heinrich counted at least a dozen figures moving through the shadows. Professional, military precision. These weren't local authorities responding to a disturbance call. Werner let out a hollow laugh. 27 years you've hidden here playing the simple farmer. How many nights did you lie awake wondering if this day would come?" "Every night," Heinrich admitted. He finally turned to face his captives, his fellow Germans, his former comrades, in a war that had ended decades ago, but whose ghosts still haunted them all. "But I stopped running long ago. This farm, this life, it became real, more real than anything I'd known before." Heavy footsteps approached the porch. Heinrich moved to the front door and opened it before they could knock. A tall man in a dark coat stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn gloom. flanked by armed operatives whose faces remained hidden in shadow. "Thomas Brennan?" The man's voice carried a slight accent, German but professionally neutralized by years of international work. "That depends on who's asking." The man stepped into the light spilling from the doorway. His face was angular, intelligent, marked by the kind of controlled intensity Heinrich recognized from his own past. "My name is Director Steiner. We need to talk." Heinrich studied the man's features, noting the resemblance to someone from his distant memory. "Your father?" "Colonel Steiner. He commanded the 12th Panzer Division." The director's expression remained neutral. "He spent the last 30 years of his life hunting war criminals, and you've inherited his work," in a manner of speaking. Steiner gestured toward the house. "May we come in? We have much to discuss." Heinrich stepped aside, allowing Steiner and 2 operatives to enter. The director's gaze swept the kitchen, taking in the bound prisoners, the scattered documents, the evidence of Heinrich's careful preparation for this moment. Klaus lifted his head defiantly. "He knows everything. We made sure of that before you arrived." Steiner approached the table, his eyes scanning the photographs and reports. His professional composure cracked slightly as he recognized certain images. "Mein Gott. These are authentic?" "Every page," Dietrich said. "Operation Nachtigall, the Vatican connection, the American industrialists, the Swiss banks, all of it." The director picked up a photograph showing Nazi officials meeting with prominent American businessmen in a Swiss chateau. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "If these documents reach the public, they won't," Heinrich said firmly. "That was never my intention." Steiner turned to study him. "Then what is your intention, Herr Mueller?" The use of his real name struck Heinrich like a physical blow. After 27 years of being Thomas Brennan, hearing his true identity spoken aloud felt like watching his carefully constructed world collapse, which he supposed it was. "Justice," Heinrich said simply. "Not the kind that plays out in newspapers or courtrooms, the kind that settles old debts privately." One of Steiner's operatives whispered urgently in his ear. The director nodded grimly. "We're not the only ones coming for you. American intelligence is 15 minutes behind us, and they won't be interested in conversation." Heinrich had expected this too. The conspiracy his 3 visitors had exposed reached too far into powerful institutions to remain buried quietly. Too many people had too much to lose. "Then I suggest we conclude our business quickly," Heinrich said. He moved to the kitchen stove and struck a match. The flame danced in his weathered fingers as he looked one final time at the documents that could have toppled governments and destroyed carefully maintained historical narratives. Klaus struggled against his bonds. "You can't. The world deserves to know the truth." Heinrich met his desperate gaze. "The world deserves peace. Sometimes truth is a luxury we can't afford." The match touched the papers, and decades of secrets began to burn. Outside, more vehicles approached through the breaking dawn, their engines growing louder as Heinrich Mueller prepared to face the consequences of a war that had never truly ended.